The world existed in a state of managed gray. My apartment, a fourth-floor walk-up in a building that had settled into a permanent, weary sigh, was a collection of muted tones. The walls were a color that might have once been cream but had aged into the shade of old paper. The single window looked out onto a brick wall, and the light that fought its way down the air shaft was thin and apologetic. I had arranged my life this way, a fortress of low expectations. Safety, I had learned, was found not in vibrant color but in the absence of things that could be taken away. My routine was the bedrock of this safety. Wake at 5, the sky still a bruised purple. Write for 2 hours, coaxing words from a place of deep stillness before the city woke up and screamed them into submission. Then, the uniform, black shirt, black apron. The scent of burnt coffee and steamed milk would cling to me for the next 8 hours. At the cafe, I was efficient, quiet, a ghost behind the espresso machine. People saw the hands that made their latte, not the man attached to them. It was a kind of invisibility I cultivated. The only crack in this gray facade was Julian Croft. He lived in the penthouse. Not just the top-floor apartment, but the entire top floor, a space rumored to have its own private elevator entrance, though I'd only ever seen him use the main one. He was a whisper in the building, a local legend. A tech mogul who'd cashed out years ago and now, apparently, lived a life of profound quiet directly above my head. Sometimes, late at night, I would hear the faint, melancholic notes of a piano, a sound so beautiful and sad it felt like a secret I was not meant to keep. I knew his schedule the way I knew the rhythm of my own breath. He left at 7:30 in the morning, dressed in clothes that whispered wealth rather than shouting it. Dark trousers, soft cashmere sweaters, a tailored overcoat that moved with an easy grace. He returned around 6 in the evening. His footsteps on the stairs were heavy, deliberate, the sound of a man who was never in a hurry. He was older than me, maybe by 20 years. His hair was silver at the temples, a distinguished slash against dark brown. His face was a study in controlled lines, but his eyes were a deep, thoughtful gray that seemed to absorb the light and hold it. We never spoke beyond a nod, a quiet hello, in the echoing stairwell. But I watched him. I observed the way his hands, large and capable, would rest on the brass railing. I noticed the brief, almost imperceptible softening of his expression when he saw Mrs. Gable's cat dart out of her apartment. He was a fixed point in my small, wobbly orbit, a presence that was both impossibly distant and intimately close, separated only by a few layers of plaster and floorboards. I had a single, saved text message on my phone. It was a building-wide alert from management about a water shutoff, sent months ago. His name was listed in the directory, J. Croft, Ph. It felt like holding a piece of a star. A foolish, secret thing I couldn't bring myself to delete. Then came the storm. It wasn't a dramatic, crashing affair, but a sullen, persistent November downpour that had been soaking the city for 3 days. The sky was the color of a wet stone. The air in my apartment was damp and cold, and the old radiator clanked and hissed in a futile protest against the chill. I was at my small desk, staring at a blank page, the cursor a blinking heartbeat in the gloom. The words weren't coming. They were stuck somewhere deep inside, trapped by the weight of the rain and the exhaustion that was my constant companion. The lights flickered once, twice. A groan traveled through the building's ancient wiring. And then, silence. A profound, consuming darkness fell over the room, so sudden and absolute it felt like a physical blow. The hum of the refrigerator, the buzz of the streetlights outside, the distant drone of traffic, all gone. All that remained was the sound of the rain and my own ragged breathing. My first thought was panic. It rose in my chest, hot and sharp. I hated the dark. It was a holdover from a childhood I tried not to think about, a primal fear of being unseen, of being alone with the things that lurked in the quiet. My hands trembled as I fumbled for my phone, its screen a blinding white rectangle in the blackness. 22% battery. I had one candle, a stubby, vanilla-scented thing I'd gotten as a gift, but my lighter was empty. Of course it was. I sat there for a long time, the phone's light held in a shaky hand, illuminating a small, trembling circle of my world. The desk, the cold coffee cup, the useless laptop. The darkness pressed in from all sides, vast and indifferent. This is what my life felt like most days. A small, shrinking island of light in an ocean of nothing. The self-pity was thick and cloying, and I hated myself for it, which only made it worse. A knock on the door. It was so soft I almost thought I'd imagined it. I froze, my heart hammering against my ribs. No one ever knocked on my door. Another knock, firmer this time. Deliberate. Leo. A voice from the hallway. A voice I knew. Low and calm. It cut through the darkness and the sound of the rain. It was Julian Croft. My breath hitched. I couldn't move. It was impossible. He didn't know my name. I was just the quiet man from 4B. He couldn't possibly know my name. Leo, it's Julian from the penthouse. Are you all right in there? He asked. The sound of his voice was a steadying weight. I saw your lights go out with the rest of the buildings. I know these old places can be unsettling in a blackout. I finally managed to push myself to my feet, my legs unsteady. I stumbled to the door, my hand fumbling for the lock. The metal was cold against my skin. I pulled the door open a few inches, peering into the hallway. He stood there, a silhouette against the faint emergency light at the far end of the hall. He held a candle in a simple glass holder, the flame a small, dancing star that threw flickering shadows against the wall. Hi, I managed, my voice a croak. The candlelight illuminated his face. The lines around his eyes seemed deeper in the moving light. He wasn't smiling, but his expression was open, concerned. Hello, he said, his voice as calm as it had been through the door. I have a few extra candles, if you need one. And a lighter that works. He held out a long, white candle and a heavy silver lighter. His hand was steady, the flame in his other hand barely wavering. I looked from the candle to his face, my mind a blank slate of confusion and a strange, burgeoning warmth. He knew my name. How? How do you know my name? The question tumbled out before I could stop it. A flicker of something in his gray eyes. Was it surprise? Or something else? Your name is on the mailbox, he said simply, as if it were the most obvious thing in the world. Leo Vance, he said my full name, and the sound of it in his mouth was unfamiliar, solid, real. Oh, right? I felt a flush of heat creep up my neck. Of course. It was that simple. I reached out and took the candle and lighter, my fingers brushing against his. His skin was warm, a brief, startling contact that sent a jolt through my system. It was the first time we had ever touched. Thank you, I said, my voice still rough. You're welcome, he replied. He didn't leave. He just stood there, holding his own candle, the flame casting a warm glow between us. The silence stretched, filled only by the drumming of the rain. It wasn't an awkward silence. It was watchful. Do you have everything you need? He asked. Yes, I think so. This is great. I held up the candle as if it were a precious artifact. Thank you, Mr. Croft. A small, almost smile touched his lips. Julian, please, Julian, I repeated, testing the name. It felt strange and presumptuous on my tongue. He nodded once, a gesture of confirmation. Well, try to stay warm. They're saying it could be a few hours. He took a half step back, preparing to leave. But then he paused, his gaze fixed on something over my shoulder, inside my dark apartment. I followed his line of sight to my desk, where the scattered pages of my manuscript were just visible in the gloom. You're a writer, he stated. It wasn't a question. I swallowed. I try to be. He looked back at me, his eyes searching my face in the flickering light. For a moment, I felt completely exposed, as if the darkness had stripped away my carefully constructed invisibility. He saw me. Not just the barista, not just the neighbor in 4B. Me. Good night, Leo, he said softly. And then he turned and walked away, his footsteps sure and steady on the stairs, his small flame disappearing around the bend, leaving me alone in the dark again. But it was a different kind of darkness now. It was a darkness with a memory of light. I closed the door, lit my new candle, and for the first time in a long time, I didn't feel quite so alone. The power returned in the early hours of the morning with a sudden, jarring hum. The lights flickered on, harsh and unforgiving after the soft candlelight. I had fallen asleep at my desk, my cheek pressed against the cool wood. The candle Julian had given me had burned down to a small, waxy puddle. I saved it, tucking the hardened disk of wax into my desk drawer like a secret keepsake. In the days that followed, the building settled back into its routine, but something inside me had shifted. The foundation of my quiet, gray world had been subtly altered. My awareness of Julian, which had been a passive, background hum, sharpened into a focused, acute sensitivity. I was listening for his footsteps above me, for the sound of his key in the main door. The brief, polite nods in the hallway were no longer enough. I found myself craving another interaction, another moment of connection in the dim, echoing stairwell. I started observing him more closely, not as a distant, abstract figure, but as a man. I saw him one Saturday morning in the small, shared courtyard behind our building. He was kneeling, tending to a small patch of neglected earth by the back wall. He wore old jeans and a simple gray t-shirt that stretched across his broad shoulders. His hands, which I had only seen as steady and graceful, were covered in dirt as he carefully cleared away weeds from around a struggling rose bush. There was a quiet competence in his movements, a gentle focus that was captivating. He wasn't performing for anyone. He was simply existing, caring for a small, forgotten thing. The sight caused a strange ache in my chest, a yearning so profound it almost stole my breath. My internal world became a constant stream of analysis. When we passed on the stairs and he said, "Good morning, Leo," I would spend the next hour replaying the two words in my head. Did his voice sound warmer than usual? Was the slight incline of his head a simple acknowledgement or something more? It was madness, I knew. I was building a palace of meaning out of a handful of bricks. He was a wealthy, successful man living in a different universe. I was the guy who smelled like coffee and worried about making rent. The chasm between our lives was immense, a vast, unbridgeable canyon. And yet, there was a pull, an undeniable gravity. It was in the way his gaze would sometimes linger for a fraction of a second too long when we met. It was in the quiet space he seemed to hold for me, never crowding, never demanding, just present. My mind would race, cataloging every micro-expression, every subtle shift in his posture. I was a scholar of Julian Croft, studying a text written in a language I was only just beginning to understand. I told myself it was just a writer's observation, a character study. It was a lie, but it was a necessary one. It kept the hope from growing too large, too dangerous. One afternoon, I was struggling up the stairs with a week's worth of groceries, the cheap paper bags threatening to give way. As I fumbled for my keys on the fourth-floor landing, one of the bags ripped. An orange escaped, then an apple, and then a cascade of potatoes bounced and clattered down the stairs. I cursed under my breath, my face burning with a familiar, helpless frustration. It was such a small thing, but it felt like the final straw on a day of 1,000 tiny failures. "Let me help you with that," Julian's voice came from above me. He was on his way down, dressed to go out. He descended the stairs with that unhurried grace of his and began gathering the runaway potatoes without a word. I stood there, frozen with embarrassment, clutching my remaining groceries. "You don't have to do that," I mumbled, my cheeks on fire. "It's no trouble," he said, his voice calm and even. He collected the last of the vegetables and stood up, holding them in his large, cupped hands. "Here." I opened my reusable tote bag, and he gently placed the potatoes inside. As he did, his fingers brushed against mine. It was nothing, a fleeting, incidental contact. But it was like the blackout all over again. A spark, a sudden, sharp intake of breath. This time, however, he didn't pull away immediately. For a single, suspended moment, his hand lingered, the warmth of his skin a solid, grounding presence against my own. I looked up and met his eyes. The air in the stairwell grew thick, heavy. The usual polite distance between us had collapsed. In his gray eyes, I saw not pity, but a deep, quiet understanding. It felt as if he could see right through my flustered exterior to the lonely, overwhelmed man beneath. He finally drew his hand back, the spell broken. "Are you all right?" he asked, his voice a little lower than before. "Fine. Yes. Just a long day," I managed to say. He nodded slowly, his gaze still holding mine. "I understand those," he gestured to my door. "Let me at least hold these while you get your key." I didn't argue. I handed him the remaining bags, my hands trembling slightly as I finally managed to fit the key in the lock. He stood beside me, a silent, steady presence. The scent of him was subtle, clean, like fresh linen and cold air. It was a scent of quiet luxury, of a life so different from my own. When the door was open, he followed me inside and set the bags down on my small kitchen counter. My apartment suddenly felt impossibly small and shabby with him in it. I was acutely aware of the stack of unread books on the floor, the faded print on the wall, the general air of making do. He however, didn't seem to notice. His eyes scanned the room, not with judgment, but with a kind of gentle curiosity. His gaze landed on my desk, on the neat stack of manuscript pages. "Don't let me keep you from your work," he said. "You're not." I was procrastinating, I admitted, a small, humorless laugh escaping me. He gave me that almost smile again. "The hardest part of the process," he paused at the door, his hand on the knob. "Leo," he began, then stopped, as if reconsidering his words. "Yes," I prompted, my heart rate kicking up a notch. "If you ever need a hand with anything, don't hesitate to ask," he said. It sounded formal, but his eyes conveyed a different message, something warmer and more personal. "Thank you, Julian." "I will." He nodded once more, and then he was gone. I stood in the middle of my tiny kitchen, the air still seeming to hold the shape of his presence. The brief touch of his hand, the weight of his gaze, the quiet offer of help. It all coalesced into a feeling that was both terrifying and exhilarating. The gray walls of my life were beginning to show cracks, and through them, a sliver of impossible light was starting to shine. And I was afraid. I was so terribly afraid of what would happen if I let it in. A week later, a notice was posted in the lobby. The building was fumigating, and all residents needed to vacate their apartments for 12 hours, from 8 in the morning until 8 at night. It was a Tuesday, my day off, of course. The notice sent a familiar wave of low-grade panic through me. I had nowhere to go. My budget didn't allow for a day spent in cafes, buying coffee after coffee to justify my existence. I couldn't afford a hotel room. I pictured myself wandering the city streets for 12 hours, a vagrant in my own life. I was standing there, staring at the notice and feeling the dread curdle in my stomach, when Julian came down the stairs. He stopped beside me, reading the sign. I was intensely aware of his proximity, the solid warmth of his body just a few feet from mine. "Inconvenient," he murmured, his voice a low rumble. He glanced at me, his brow furrowed slightly. "Do you have somewhere to go on Tuesday?" The direct question caught me off guard. I could lie, of course. I could say I was meeting a friend or going to the library. But something in his direct, non-judgmental gaze made the lie stick in my throat. "Not really," I admitted, my eyes fixed on the floor. "I'll probably just find a park bench somewhere." I tried to make it sound casual, bohemian, but it came out sounding as pathetic as it felt. He was silent for a moment. I braced myself for the awkward platitude, the well-meaning but useless suggestion. "Instead," he said, "I have a small office downtown that I rarely use. It's quiet, has a comfortable chair, a desk, and a fast internet connection. You're welcome to use it for the day, if you'd like. No one will bother you." I looked up at him, stunned. The offer was so simple, so practical, yet it felt monumental. It was a life raft thrown into my churning sea of anxiety. But my pride, that stubborn, foolish thing, immediately bristled. I couldn't accept. It was too much. It was a favor that would put me in his debt, that would upset the fragile, unspoken balance between us. "I couldn't," I said quickly. "That's too generous." He didn't argue or try to persuade me. He simply watched my face, his expression unreadable. "It's an empty room, Leo," he said softly. "It would be a shame for it to sit unused when it could be of help. I would be working from home that day, but I have a country house I can retreat to. It is genuinely no imposition." He paused, and his next words were chosen with deliberate care. "I hope my offer doesn't feel obligatory. It's just an empty space. You can accept or decline, and it changes nothing between us." There it was again. That incredible perception. He had seen my fear, my pride, my worry about the power dynamic between us, and he had addressed it head-on. He named the boundary, assuring me of my own agency. He was not offering charity. He was offering a solution with no strings attached. It was a moment of profound vulnerability on his part, an admission that he was worried about how he was perceived, about being seen as controlling or coercive. It was a gift of trust. The tension in my shoulders eased. "Okay," I breathed, the word a small puff of surrender. "Thank you, Julian. I'd really appreciate that." The relief in his eyes was subtle but unmistakable. "Good," he said. He reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a small, sleek key card. "I'll email you the address and the instructions. The Wi-Fi password is on a note on the desk." He handed me the card. It was smooth and cool in my palm. "The place is yours for the day. Come and go as you please." On Tuesday morning, I found the address easily. It was a discreet, elegant building in a quieter part of the financial district. The key card granted me access to the elevator, which whisked me silently up to the 20th floor. The office was not small. It was a corner suite with floor-to-ceiling windows that offered a breathtaking, panoramic view of the city and the harbor beyond. A large mahogany desk stood in the center of the room, facing the view. A plush leather chair was tucked behind it. In the corner, there was a comfortable-looking armchair and a small table with a high-end coffee machine. It was bigger than my entire apartment. For the first hour, I just stood by the window, mesmerized. I watched the ferries glide across the water, the traffic flow like blood through the city's arteries. It was a god's-eye view, a perspective of power and control that was entirely alien to me. This was his world, a world of quiet efficiency, of effortless luxury. The thought should have been intimidating, but strangely, it wasn't. The space didn't feel sterile or corporate. It felt calm. It felt like him. A note was propped against the computer monitor, just as he'd said. It was his handwriting, strong, clean, and slanted slightly to the right. Leo, the Wi-Fi password is, help yourself to coffee. Hope you have a productive day. Julian. I sat down in the leather chair. It was ridiculously comfortable. I opened my laptop, but I didn't write. Instead, I just sat there, breathing in the quiet. I felt safe, cared for. The anxiety that was a constant hum beneath the surface of my life had gone silent. He had done this. With a simple, thoughtful gesture, he had given me a day of peace. I made myself a coffee from the fancy machine. It was the best coffee I had ever tasted. I sat in the armchair by the window, sipping it slowly, and I felt a profound sense of gratitude wash over me. It wasn't just about the office, or the coffee, or the view. It was about being seen. He had seen my struggle, and he had offered help in a way that respected my dignity. He had trusted me with a piece of his world. And in that quiet, sun-drenched office, high above the city, I realized I was in serious trouble. The small, secret crush I had been nursing had blossomed into something much larger, something deeper and more terrifying. It was no longer just an attraction to a handsome, mysterious neighbor. It was a powerful, undeniable connection to a man who was kind, perceptive, and unexpectedly gentle. The gray walls were not just cracking anymore. They were beginning to crumble. That evening, when I returned the key card, I slipped a note of my own under his door. It was simple, just a few lines on a piece of paper. Julian, thank you. Not just for the office, but for your kindness. It meant more than you know. Leo. I hesitated before sliding it under the door, my heart pounding. It felt like a confession. The next day, there was a small envelope with my name on it in my mailbox. Inside was a single, thick piece of cardstock. His handwriting was on it. Leo, you are most welcome. The kindness was all mine to receive. Julian. I kept the note. I put it in the desk drawer, right next to the hardened puddle of vanilla-scented wax. My collection of secrets was growing. The comfortable distance we'd maintained was gone, replaced by a delicate, charged awareness. Our brief encounters in the stairwell became freighted with unspoken meaning. A shared glance would linger, a simple hello would seem to hold the weight of a longer conversation. The silence between us was no longer empty. It was filled with questions I was too afraid to ask, and answers he seemed unwilling to give. The tipping point came on a Saturday, during the building's annual, and usually dreadful, tenant potluck held in the courtyard. I normally avoided it, but Mrs. Gable from 2A had personally invited me, and her hopeful smile was impossible to refuse. The courtyard was filled with folding tables, mismatched chairs, and the awkward mingling of strangers who shared walls, but nothing else. I stood by the snack table, nursing a plastic cup of cheap wine, feeling profoundly out of place. A man I recognized from the 3rd floor, a loud, overbearing type named Mark, cornered me by the dip. Vance, right? The writer, he said, his voice a little too loud. I nodded, offering a tight smile. Heard you've been getting friendly with the king in his castle upstairs, he went on, jerking his head towards the penthouse. Smart move. An artist needs a patron, right? His words hit me like a physical slap. The insinuation was ugly, transactional, and it landed directly on my deepest insecurity. He was voicing the very fear that haunted my late-night thoughts, that people would see my connection with Julian not as genuine, but as a calculated move for personal gain, that they would see me as a leech, a gold digger. My face flushed hot with shame and anger. I don't know what you're talking about, I said, my voice cold. Mark just laughed, a dismissive, knowing sound. Sure you don't. Just be careful. Guys like Croft don't do anything for free. There's always a price. Before I could form a response, a quiet voice cut through the air behind me. Is there a problem here? It was Julian. He had appeared so silently, I hadn't even noticed him arrive. He stood just behind my shoulder, his presence a sudden, solid wall of calm. He wasn't looking at me. His cool, gray eyes were fixed on Mark. He hadn't raised his voice, but there was an unmistakable edge of steel in it. Mark's smug expression faltered. He suddenly looked like a schoolboy caught misbehaving. No problem, Croft, he stammered, taking a step back. Just making conversation with the neighbor. I see, Julian said, his gaze unwavering. Well, Leo and I were just about to discuss the final edits on his manuscript. Weren't we, Leo? He turned his head slightly, his eyes meeting mine. It was an out. A clear, protective gesture that instantly reframed the situation, positioning me as a serious professional, not a target of gossip. He was making his respect for me public. I was so stunned, all I could do was nod. Yes, we were, if you'll excuse us, Julian said, his tone leaving no room for argument. He placed a hand lightly on the small of my back, a gesture that was both a reassurance and a steering mechanism. It was a brief, possessive touch that sent a shiver down my spine. He guided me away from the potluck, away from the prying eyes and the cheap wine, and towards the quiet sanctuary of the stairwell. Once we were inside, the sounds of the party muffled behind the heavy door, he let his hand drop. He leaned against the wall, his arms crossed over his chest, and let out a slow breath. I'm sorry, he said, his voice low. I shouldn't have interfered. But I couldn't stand by and listen to that. Thank you, I said, my voice barely a whisper. My entire body was humming with adrenaline and a confusing mix of gratitude and turmoil. You didn't have to do that. Yes, I did, he countered, his expression serious. He pushed himself off the wall and took a step closer. We were standing near the spot where he had helped me with my groceries, the air between us just as thick and charged as it had been then. Leo, what he said, it's not true. None of it, I know, I said, though a part of me hadn't been so sure until that very moment. I need you to know, he continued, his voice earnest, that my friendship, that my offers of help, come with no expectations. There is no price. He searched my face, his gray eyes intense. Your independence, your agency, they are paramount. I would never want you to feel beholden to me. Ever. He was doing it again. He was naming the fear, bringing the subtext into the light. He was giving me the power, reassuring me that I was in control of our dynamic. The care in his words, the deliberate way he was handling this, was more intimate than any touch. Julian, I started, not sure what I was going to say. My heart was a frantic drum against my ribs. The unspoken feelings between us were a palpable force in the dim light of the stairwell. Silence was no longer an option. The tension had to break. What do you want, Leo? He asked, his voice soft but direct. It was a loaded question, and we both knew it. He wasn't asking about the potluck or about Mark. He was asking about us. Here it is. The open door. I can walk through it. Or I can turn and run back to the safety of my gray, lonely world. My breath catches in my throat. My hands are trembling. This is the moment everything changes. I don't know. I lied, my voice shaking. It was a coward's answer. He didn't call me on it. He just nodded, a flicker of disappointment in his eyes that was like a physical pain in my own chest. All right, he said, his voice losing some of its warmth. He took a step back, creating a distance between us that felt like a mile. Well, I'll let you get back to your evening. He turned to go up the stairs, and a wave of panic washed over me. I couldn't let him walk away. I couldn't let this moment, this fragile, terrifying possibility, slip through my fingers. Wait, I called out, my voice louder than I intended. He stopped, his back still to me. That was a lie, I said, the words rushing out of me in a torrent. I do know what I want. He turned around slowly. His face was a mask of careful neutrality, but his eyes were burning with a question. I took a deep breath, the air tasting of dust and rain and possibility. I want this, I said, gesturing to the space between us. Whatever this is, I want to not be afraid of it. It was a clumsy confession, but it was honest. It was the most honest thing I had said in years. A long, silent moment passed. He just looked at me, his gaze so intense I felt it in my bones. Then, Very slowly, he descended the single step he had taken. He stopped in front of me, so close I could feel the heat radiating from his body. He didn't speak. He just lifted his hand and gently, so gently, tucked a stray strand of hair behind my ear. His fingers were warm against my temple. The simple, tender gesture undid me completely. "Okay," he whispered, his voice thick with an emotion I couldn't name. "Okay, Leo. We won't be afraid of it." And in the dim, dusty light of the stairwell, surrounded by the ghosts of our polite greetings and missed opportunities, something new and fragile and incredibly hopeful began to take root. The storm returned that night, a mirror of the one that had started everything. The wind howled, rattling the old windows in their frames, and the rain came down in hard, driving sheets. And then, just as before, the world plunged into darkness. This time, however, there was no panic. I found the candle Julian had given me, the one I'd lit the first time, and the silver lighter he'd left. My hands were steady as I struck the flint. The flame caught, a small, brave flicker in the overwhelming black. A knock came at the door, soft and expected. I opened it to find him standing there, holding a candle of his own, just like before. The sense of déjà vu was so strong, it was dizzying. But everything was different now. The question that had hung between us and the stairwell had been answered. "I thought you might need this," he said, though his eyes told me he knew I was fine. He was just looking for a reason. "Come in," I said, stepping back to let him pass. He entered my small apartment, and the space seemed to shrink around his solid presence. He placed his candle on my small coffee table, next to mine. The two flames danced together, their light merging, pushing back the shadows. We stood there in the quiet, the storm raging outside, the two small lights a defiant beacon in the center of the room. "It seems we're destined to have our most important conversations in the dark," he said, a hint of a smile in his voice. I let out a shaky laugh. "It seems so." He turned to face me, his expression serious now in the flickering light. "Leo," he said, his voice low and resonant. "The manuscript you mentioned, the one I interrupted you from editing," my heart stuttered. My writing was the most private, most vulnerable part of me. It was a landscape of all my fears, my hopes, my secret loneliness. The thought of sharing it was terrifying. "What about it?" I asked, my voice tight. He took a step closer, his gaze soft and unwavering. "I'm not a patron," he said, his voice firm, echoing his words from the courtyard. "And I'm not a critic, but I would very much like to be a reader. If you'd let me." It was the ultimate request for intimacy. He wasn't asking for my body, he was asking for my soul. He was asking to see the part of me I kept hidden from the world, the part one was most convinced was worthless. The fear was a cold knot in my stomach. But beneath it, a current of warmth was spreading through me. He wanted to know me, the real me. I found myself shaking. A fine, uncontrollable tremor that started in my hands and spread through my entire body. It wasn't from cold or fear, but from the sheer, overwhelming force of the emotion crashing over me. To be seen, to be asked for, so completely. Julian's expression softened with concern. He reached out, not to touch me, but to steady the air between us. "Leo, it's not very good," I whispered, the old, familiar insecurity surfacing. "I'll be the judge of that," he said gently. He took another small step, closing the remaining distance between us. He lifted his hand and placed it softly against my jaw, his thumb stroking my cheek. The contact was electric, a current of warmth that chased away the trembling. He tilted my head up, forcing me to meet his gaze. His eyes were dark pools in the candlelight, full of a deep, patient tenderness. "Read to me," he whispered. "Read me your story." The world narrowed to the circle of our candlelight, to the feel of his hand on my skin, to the sincerity in his deep gray eyes. "This is it. This is the precipice. I can let him see me, or I can retreat forever. The choice is mine, and for the first time in my life, I choose not to be afraid." I nodded, a single, jerky movement. I walked over to my desk on unsteady legs and picked up the first few pages of my manuscript. The paper felt heavy, significant in my trembling hands. I sat on the edge of my worn armchair, and he sat on the floor in front of me, his back against the sofa, his long legs stretched out. He didn't loom over me. He made himself smaller, less intimidating. He was giving me all the power. I took a deep, shuddering breath and began to read. The words felt alien in my mouth at first, clumsy and self-conscious. But Julian listened with a profound stillness, his gaze fixed on my face, his attention an absolute, unwavering gift. And as I read, the story took over. The story of a lonely boy in a gray world, who learned to find color not in his surroundings, but in the secret worlds he built in his own mind. It was my story, thinly veiled in fiction. When I finished the first chapter, I let the pages fall into my lap. The silence that followed was absolute, broken only by the sound of the rain against the window. I couldn't look at him. I stared at my hands, my heart hammering, waiting for the verdict. "It's beautiful," he said, his voice thick with emotion. I finally dared to look up. His face was illuminated by the twin flames, and I could see the glistening track of a single tear on his cheek. He made no move to wipe it away. "You see things, Leo," he said, his voice a raw whisper. "You see the cracks in the world, and you find the light that shines through them." My own eyes filled with tears. No one had ever understood. No one had ever seen the heart of what I was trying to do. He rose to his knees in front of me, his hands coming up to cup my face. His palms were warm and slightly rough against my skin. He searched my eyes, a silent question in his. I gave him the answer without words. I leaned forward, closing the last inch of space between us. His lips were soft, hesitant at first, a gentle question. And then, as I responded, the kiss deepened. It wasn't a kiss of frantic passion or desperate need. It was a kiss of recognition, of arrival. It tasted of rain and wax and a profound, soul-deep relief. It felt like coming home to a place I hadn't known I was searching for. His arms wrapped around me, pulling me from the chair and down to the floor with him, into a gentle, enveloping embrace. His fingers laced through my hair, his body a solid, grounding weight against mine. Everything felt right, unforced. In the flickering candlelight, surrounded by the storm, I wasn't the lonely man from 4B anymore. I was just Leo, and for the first time, that felt like enough. I woke to the pale, watery light of dawn filtering through my window. For a confusing moment, I didn't know where I was. Then it all came rushing back. The blackout, the story, the kiss. I was on the floor of my living room, tangled in a blanket I didn't remember getting, my head resting on a pillow from my couch. Julian was gone. A cold dread seeped into my bones, chilling me more than the morning air. The room was empty. The candles were gone, the coffee table neat. It was as if he had never been there. Had I dreamed it all? Was it just a fantasy conjured from loneliness and the strange intimacy of a storm? But then I saw it. On the table, next to the spot where our candles had burned together, was a single, perfect white rose in a small glass of water. And beside it, a folded note. My heart hammered as I reached for it. It was his handwriting again, clean and sure. "I didn't want to wake you. There's coffee. Talk soon. Julian." He had made coffee. I turned and saw my old, cheap coffee maker had a fresh pot brewing, the rich aroma filling the small apartment. The gesture was so simple, so domestic, it made my chest ache. It was real. It had all been real. The kiss, the confession, the tears. The relief was so immense it made me dizzy. But as the initial wave of relief subsided, a new tide of anxiety rolled in. The morning light was harsh, illuminating not just the shabbiness of my apartment, but the glaring reality of our situation. He was Julian Croft, a man who could buy and sell this entire building without a second thought. And I was Leo Vance, a man who counted his tips at the end of every shift to see if he could afford a new book. The intimacy of the candlelit darkness felt a world away from the cold, hard facts of the morning. What now? What did this mean? Was I his new project? A curiosity? The ugly words of that man at the potluck echoed in my mind. An artist needs a patron. My stomach churned. The power imbalance between us, which had seemed to meld away in the dark, now felt like a vast, insurmountable mountain. How could we ever build something real on such unequal ground? I would always be the one in need, the one receiving. The thought filled me with a familiar, bitter shame. I spent the day in a fog of uncertainty, replaying every moment, analyzing every word. My mind was a battlefield of hope and fear. Hope, because the connection between us felt more real than anything I had ever known. Fear, because the practicalities of our lives seemed destined to crush that connection under their immense weight. I was so lost in my own head that I nearly jumped out of my skin when my phone buzzed with a text message from an unknown number. Leo, it's Julian. I hope your day is going well. I was wondering if you might be free for dinner tonight. There's a quiet place I know. No pressure at all if you're not up to it. The message was a perfect reflection of him. Direct, considerate, and with an explicit out. No pressure. He was still being so careful with me, so respectful of my space and my agency. Reading the words, some of the anxiety in my chest began to loosen its grip. This wasn't the behavior of a man looking for a pet project. This was the behavior of a man genuinely interested in getting to know someone and doing it on their terms. I texted back, my fingers clumsy. I'd like that very much. His reply was immediate. Wonderful. I'll pick you up at 7. That evening, he didn't arrive in a flashy car. He simply knocked on my door at 7 o'clock sharp, dressed in dark trousers and a soft, charcoal gray sweater. He looked devastatingly handsome, and my heart did a nervous flip. Ready? He asked, his smile gentle. We walked. The restaurant was only a few blocks away, a small, unassuming Italian place tucked away on a side street. It was warm and dimly lit, the air filled with the scent of garlic and wine. It was intimate and cozy, not the kind of flashy, expensive place I had imagined. It was a place chosen for conversation, not for show. Once we were seated in a quiet corner booth, a comfortable silence settled between us. It wasn't the charged, questioning silence of before. It was softer, more settled. Julian broke it first. I want to be clear about something, he said, his gaze direct and serious. Last night was important to me, and I want to be sure that you feel the same, and that you don't feel pressured by any of it. I do, I said, my voice quiet but firm. It was important to me, too. But I'm also nervous about what? He asked, his expression open, inviting honesty. I took a deep breath. About this, I said, gesturing between us. About the differences. The money, everything. I don't want to be a project, Julian. I don't want to lose myself in your world. He listened intently, his chin resting on his hand. When I finished, he nodded slowly. Thank you for telling me that, he said. Your fear is valid, and I will do everything in my power to make sure it never comes to pass. Your world, your writing, your life, that's all yours. I just want to be invited into it. And I'd like to invite you into mine. Not as a guest, but as a partner. If that's what you want. We can define the boundaries together. We can take this as slowly as you need. His reassurance was a balm on my frayed nerves. He wasn't dismissing my fears. He was validating them and offering to work through them with me. He was offering a partnership of equals. Just then, the waiter arrived to take our order. As I was looking at the menu, I saw a familiar face across the room. It was Mark, the man from the potluck. He was at a table with a group of friends, and he was staring directly at us. He caught my eye, and a smug, knowing smirk spread across his face. He lifted his wine glass in a mock toast. A cold wave of dread washed over me. This was it. The test. The first intrusion of the outside world into our fragile, nascent connection. My face must have betrayed my anxiety, because Julian's gaze immediately sharpened. What is it? He asked, his voice low. I nodded subtly in Mark's direction. Company. Julian glanced over, his expression unreadable. He saw Mark, saw the smirk, and understood immediately. I braced myself, expecting him to get angry, to confront him, to cause a scene. Instead, he did something completely unexpected. He turned back to me, his focus absolute, and reached across the table to take my hand. His grip was warm and firm. Let him look, he said softly, his thumb tracing circles on the back of my hand. He doesn't matter. What matters is right here, in this booth. You and me. He held my gaze, and in his eyes, I saw nothing but calm, steady reassurance. He wasn't going to fight my battles for me. He was going to stand with me while I fought them myself. He was showing me, not telling me, that we were a we, and that other people's opinions had no power over us unless we gave it to them. I took a breath and squeezed his hand. I looked across the room, met Mark's gaze directly, and gave him a small, calm smile before turning my full attention back to Julian. Mark's smirk faltered. He looked away, defeated. In that small, quiet moment, I felt a shift inside me. The shame and fear had been replaced by a quiet strength. With Julian by my side, I wasn't afraid. We didn't talk about it again. We ordered dinner, we talked about books, about music, about my writing. He asked me questions, real questions, and he listened to the answers as if they were the most important things in the world. And for the first time, I felt like I was building not a fortress, but a bridge. A bridge between my world and his, built on a foundation of trust, respect, and the quiet, steady strength of his hand in mine. Over the next few weeks, we settled into a gentle, unhurried rhythm. We were building our new reality, one day at a time. We kept our separate apartments, our separate lives, but we wove them together with deliberate care. Some nights, we would cook dinner in his large, beautiful kitchen, the space filled with music and easy laughter. Other nights, we would order takeout and eat it sitting on the floor of my tiny apartment, surrounded by my books and papers. He never once made me feel like my space was inferior. He simply fit himself into it, his presence making it feel less like a temporary shelter and more like a home. We had a conversation, a real one, about boundaries and expectations. It wasn't a dramatic, heavy discussion, but a calm, practical talk over coffee one Sunday morning. "I want you to keep your job at the cafe," he said, his expression serious. "Unless you decide you don't want it anymore. I will never ask you to give up your financial independence. If you ever need anything, I hope you'll feel you can ask, but I will never offer in a way that makes you feel obligated." And my writing, I added, my voice quiet. "I need that to be mine. I don't want you to be my editor or my agent. Just my reader. The first 1 inch, always," he promised, his eyes sincere. "That's all I ever want to be." It was a conscious choice. We were two adults, from vastly different circumstances, choosing to build a life together. We were naming the potential pitfalls, the money, the power dynamics, and agreeing to navigate them with honesty and care. He gave me a key to his apartment. It wasn't a grand gesture. He just pressed it into my hand one evening as I was leaving. "For the next blackout," he said with a small smile. "Or, for whenever you want to come over." The key felt heavy and solid in my palm, a symbol of trust and belonging. One Saturday morning, I woke up in his bed. The sun was streaming through the massive windows of the penthouse, painting streaks of gold across the white linens. Julian was still asleep, his breathing deep and even. I slipped out of bed and padded into the kitchen. The view of the city waking up was breathtaking, but it no longer felt alien or intimidating. It just felt beautiful. I started making coffee, moving around the large kitchen with a growing sense of familiarity. I knew where he kept the mugs, where the sugar was. A few minutes later, he appeared in the doorway, his hair tousled from sleep, a soft smile on his face. He didn't speak. He just came up behind me, wrapped his arms around my waist, and rested his chin on my shoulder. We stood there for a long time, watching the steam rise from the coffee pot, the city spread out before us like a promise. It wasn't a dramatic, cinematic moment. There was no soaring music, no grand declaration of love. It was just quiet, a quiet, domestic intimacy that felt more profound and real than any fireworks. It felt like arrival, like peace. The gentle weight of his arms around me, the scent of coffee, the morning sun on my face. It was a perfect, simple moment of contentment. Later that day, we were sitting on his balcony, reading in comfortable silence. The city hummed below us, a distant, soothing sound. I put my book down and just looked at him. He was absorbed in his own reading, a pair of glasses perched on his nose. The lines on his face were relaxed, the usual guardedness gone. In that moment, I saw him not as Julian Croft, the tech mogul, but as Julian, the man who tended to neglected rose bushes, who cried at a lonely writer's story, who made coffee for me in the morning. He must have felt my gaze, because he looked up, his gray eyes soft. "What is it?" he asked. "Nothing," I said, a slow smile spreading across my face. "Everything." I thought back to the man I was just a few months ago, living in a fortress of gray, convinced that safety lay in solitude. I had been so afraid of letting anyone in, so sure that connection would only lead to pain. And now, here I was, in a life more vibrant and full of color than I had ever imagined possible. The difference in our ages, in our bank accounts, hadn't vanished. It was still a fact of our lives, a piece of our context. But it was no longer a cage or a barrier. It was just one part of our story. He had used his resources not to control me, but to create a space where I could feel safe enough to be vulnerable. He had used his stability not to make me dependent, but to give me a steady place to stand so I could find my own strength. He had opened a door, but he had waited for me to walk through it. He had lit a candle in my darkness, but he had let me be the one to share my own story, to give my own light. He hadn't rescued me. He had simply sat with me in the dark until I was ready to find my own way out. And in doing so, he had given me the greatest gift of all, a partnership of equals, a love built not on need, but on a deep, abiding respect. A quiet foundation had settled deep within me, solid and sure. I was no longer a ghost behind a coffee machine. I was a man who was loved. I was a writer with a story to tell. And for the first time, I was not afraid to let my voice be heard. I was finally home. Share your thoughts in the comments. What moment stayed with you? If the story resonated, a like helps others find it. Subscribe for more slow burn male/male love stories told with warmth and care.